Ms. Nicholas again. I'm going to talk to you just briefly about adrenal cortex regions and give you a silly little way to remember the different layers, the hormones that they secrete, and the primary actions of those hormones. So let's get started. First of all, just a brief reminder about the adrenal glands and where they are located. So in this image, of course, you see the kidneys. Of course, you also see the inferior vena cava and the abdominal aorta. So hopefully that's our review to you. And then, of course, the kidneys sitting on the left and the right. And on top of the kidneys, somewhat medial and superior, you see the adrenal glands. So you have a left and right adrenal gland. Over here we have two adrenal glands that we've removed from the kidneys and simply done a cross section on them so you can see the two main areas, the outermost area being the cortex, and then the inner region, let's change colors here. The inner region is the medulla, and the very outermost covering is the capsule. So the capsule is just like a capsule around your Tylenol medication or any other medication in the capsule form. The capsule forms a tough outer protective covering. Then within the capsule you have first the cortex and then the middle part, the medulla. All right, so what we're going to be looking at today are the different layers found within the adrenal cortex. So if we begin again with the outermost capsule, then we divide the next three layers into zones or zona. So beginning with the capsule, you first have the zona glomerulosa, then the zona fasciculata, and then the zona reticularis. And of course down here in the middle you're going to have the adrenal medulla. Now remember, you're only looking at one layer of the adrenal gland here. So down here under the medulla you're going to have the same thing starting over, but in the opposite direction because you're going from the inside out. So you're going to have glomerulosa here, fasciculata, reticularis, medulla, and then if you kept going you would have reticularis, fasciculata, and glomerulosa, if we continued that image. But now we're not going to continue on with that. We're just going to look at one part of it. So below here, now you see, of course, you have the photomicrograph, where here is your capsule. Let me get my pen back so it will write for me. Okay, you have the outermost capsule. Hi, we're going to talk just briefly about the adrenal cortex and the different regions found within. Then we'll talk briefly about some of the major hormones secreted from each of those areas, and just briefly as well about the function of those hormones. You'll get more of this in a later video. This is just an overview for you and a silly little memory hint to help you understand and to remember these. All right, so we want to go ahead and get started now first with just a reminder of Hi. We're going to talk briefly about the adrenal cortex and the regions found within the cortex, as well as to briefly look at the different hormones or the major hormones, as well as the functions of those hormones. And you're going to get more on this when your instructors talk to you about these different layers in the hormones. This is just a brief overview and perhaps a little memory trick to help you remember the layers and the hormones. So let's get started. We'll start first with just a reminder of where the adrenal glands are located. Of course, here we have the inferior vena cava and the aorta. Okay, so we are in the abdominopelvic cavity, and you have your right and left kidneys, and sitting on top of and somewhat medial to the kidneys, you have your two adrenal glands. Over here you see the adrenal glands that have been removed from the kidneys, and we've done a sagittal section through there so that you can, I'm sorry, not a sagittal section, but more of a longitudinal section through there. And we want to look at the different layers found within. So first, on the outermost covering, you have a capsule. Now that's just like a Tylenol capsule. The outer covering part just keeps everything within, so it's a tough protective covering. And then the next part inside is going to be the adrenal cortex. So think of this similar to the rind on a grapefruit or an orange. Okay, so you've got an outer layer, and then you have the inner layer, which would be the medulla. Okay, so in here you have the adrenal medulla. Now you're going to hear more about each one of these, but for the purpose of this discussion, we want to focus on that adrenal cortex and the different layers found within. So let's move to the next slide. Whoa, going the wrong direction there. Let's move to the next slide and look at those layers in a bit more detail. All right, so if we begin with the outermost capsule, down to here you have adrenal cortex. Okay, so within the adrenal cortex, we subdivide into the zona glomerulosa, then the zona fasciculata, and then the zona reticularis. Now, here, of course, you have adrenal medulla. Now, remember, if you're looking at the big picture, so let's go back over here to the adrenal gland itself. What we're looking at is this upper layer of these three zones. And here, of course, the medulla in the middle. So if you continue through the adrenal gland, you're going to have these same three zones here as well, okay? But you would begin backwards, because if you start from the capsule and go in, you've got glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. So over here, looking at the lower portion, of course, you're going to have reticularis, fasciculata, and glomerulosa. All right, so just to keep that image in your mind. Now, you can also see here a little bit of the histology, how these appear when you look at the microscope or look at these different layers in the microscope. So once again, the outermost capsule, and the glomerulosa, glom means ball-like, okay? So when you see G-L-O-M, think ball or round. Okay? So you will see that you have sort of clusters of cells that appear somewhat all wadded up into balls. A fascicle is a long tubular structure. Okay? So even though this picture doesn't show it as well, most of the time you're going to see cells that are somewhat arranged in columns. And then reticularis, reticular, is, and that is a U there, I promise, it's a net, okay, or a mesh. Okay, so in your reticularis, your cells are going to be somewhat all meshed together. And sometimes on the microscope slides, you're going to see that they will appear to have a somewhat flowy appearance to them, and that's not because they're that way in the living tissue, but because they sort of get squished and deformed a bit when the slides are being prepared. All right, so now let's continue looking at these layers with a little more detail. And you may be wondering, why in the world is this image here? Miss Nick is showing us waterfalls? Well, if we go back to the previous image, we can use a water analogy to understand these different layers. So typically you're going to have some rapids before the waterfall, so big wadded up balls of water. And then you have the somewhat columnar waterfalls. And then at the bottom of the waterfall, the water becomes nice and flowy again. Starting to see where I'm going with this now, right? All right, so let's take that water analogy and go back to those different layers. All right, remember using the water as our clue to remember things. Glomerulosa, we're going to have balls of water, we're in the rapids. Fasciculata, we have columns, so we're going to make that a waterfall. And then the reticularis, the nice flowing smooth water again. Okay, so each one of these different layers are going to be responsible for secreting several different hormones. But the primary hormones that we're going to focus on are the ones that we have listed here. So your glomerulosa secretes aldosterone, your fasciculata secretes cortisol, and your zona reticularis secretes the sex hormones. Okay, so if we take this even further, tying it to the water analogy, let's think about we're floating down a river in our kayak or our canoe, and we come upon rapids, great big balls of water. Okay? All of a sudden, the water is moving quickly, we're moving quickly, we can't stop to pee. Aldosterone causes you to conserve water. Now, if you're conserving water, you're not urinating it out. So, the zona glomerulosa, big balls of water, even though it's not water, you know it's really cells, but we're using our water analogy. The hormone is aldosterone, which causes you to save water. All right, the zona fasciculata, big columns of water, so those are the waterfalls. Now, if you're floating along those rapids and all of a sudden you drop down the waterfall, you're going to be stressed. All right, cortisol is the stress hormone. Tying this all together. And then once you get to the bottom of the falls and you're in the lazy flowing water, you can think about sex. Of course, you know what sex is all about. All right, so silly little analogy. Let's go back through this again. You've got your 3 layers in your adrenal cortex. Your zona glomerulosa, which appears like big balls of cells, secretes primarily aldosterone, which causes you to conserve water. Your zona fasciculata, the cells appear somewhat columnar, secrete cortisol, which is the stress hormone. Your zona reticularis, the cells may appear somewhat flowy and smooth in appearance, secretes the sex hormones, which help maintain the sexual characteristics as well as help to be responsible for the sex drive. All right, so think about this now again with the water analogy. You're floating down the rapids. You can't stop to pee. Aldosterone, save water. You're going down the waterfalls. You're stressed. You've released a lot of cortisol. You get to the bottom. You're relaxed. You're chilling. You can think about sex. Now, if this silly little analogy helps you to remember these different layers and their appearance, their hormones, and their functions, then this has served its purpose. If not, don't worry about it. Your instructor is going to help you understand all of this. And I think that's the last one. That's it, kids. Have a good day.